He said that he was pushed against a radiator by the Chicago police. He also alleged to me that he had had electric shocks placed on his lips, gums, and genitals. I believed that he was telling me a very straightforward, honest story about what happened to him. And I wrote a letter to the superintendent of the Chicago Police, Richard Brezak, and I asked that he very formally and fully investigate this allegation of excessive use of force. A number of years later, I did receive copies of letters during some of my deposition. One of the letters that I received was one written by the Superintendent of Police, Mr. Brezak, to Richard M. Daley, the state's attorney of Cook County, written on February 25th, 1982, just a little over a week after I had written my letter. And it reads, "Dear Mr. Daley, as you can see from the contents of the letter, Dr. Raba indicates that Mr. Andrew Wilson sustained certain injuries subsequent to his arrest. I will forbear from taking any steps other than the one previously mentioned in connection with these allegations until I hear from you or one of your assistants. It's signed sincerely, Richard J. Brezak, Superintendent of Police." Why would someone do that? I probably even thought deep down, why would our Chicago Police Department would do that, would they?
They took me to an isolated area I call the torture site. This is over there by Torrance, not too far from the old steel mill. And it's a big, huge pipe. You drive through the pipe, come out on the other side, it's an isolated area. You know, I had no idea that they was going to use the electric caliper on my testicles. I had no idea that they was going to play Russian roulette on me with a shotgun. You know, they was going to try to hang me up by the back of my arms. I had no idea that any of those things was going to take place. Detective Dignett, he told me that morning that, and his words were, quote, "For niggas like you, we have a scientific way of interrogating you." The more I started learning about Detective Burge, I understood that, you know, the things that he learned when he was in Vietnam, how to interrogate VCs, and that he brought that same technique that the United States Army taught him, and he brought it back to the police department, and he taught a handful of white detectives how to apply those scientific ways of interrogating people, and whether you was guilty or innocent, by the time they finished with you, you were going to say anything they wanted you to say. You was going to sign anything they wanted you to sign. I feel like 1,000 needles going through my body. I hollered, I screamed. This went on. I don't know how long, but I thought I was dying. He brought me back. One time he brought me back up, you know, pulled me up, set me back in the chair, start all over again. He took the bag off my head, and I looked at him. I couldn't believe this was happening. And he just smiling, you know, "Nigga, you gonna tell us what we wanna know?" I said, "I don't know what y'all talking about."
So my son was one of Burge's victims, which was something that people don't fully understand. Because when I found out about what Burge was fixing to torture my son, I went up to the police station and talked with him that night. And my son told me, say, "Mom," he said he's going home to get his equipment. So I said, "No, I'm going to stay here with you." And that night, I stayed in the police station with my son. And when Burge came back that morning, he had alcohol on his breath. I could smell it. He had been drinking. His eyes was red, and he was so angry when he found out that they had let me upstairs where my son was, upstairs sitting in that chair, handcuffed to the walls. He told me to get out of his police station, and I almost fell down those stairs getting out because I was so afraid.
Now, at the time, police brutality was very common. If you look at 1973, which is the year after he becomes a detective, the Tribune does an 8-part series on police brutality. And it's just about that time. They were only talking about the patrol stops. They weren't talking about the detective division. And it's just about that time that Bird starts using electric shock.
So I went to the city council meeting. They was talking about police brutality, and I spoke about what I was going through with my son and how I had been unable to get anyone to help me. It was almost like people were telling me that I should be glad they didn't kill him. But when I spoke out at the city council, that was almost like it was my last hope for help. And that's where I met Mary Powers of Citizens Alert.
We always perceive Citizens Alert as a ministry of justice, not only a ministry of justice, but a kind of a ministry of presence to the powerless or the poor or the people who have less influence and are more apt to be victimized by the system. We always kind of relied on a church constituency to back us up. And all those years and years and years, the United Methodists nationally, the Christian Church Disciples of Christ based in Indianapolis, Presbyterian Church USA from Louisville, Kentucky now, United Church of Christ, various denominations, they really bought into the fact that it was a ministry of justice and that there had to be some striving toward equality for people with less power and less influence and the victims than to be and get people with influence in the pews to identify with that problem.
After the meeting was over, she came up to me and asked me would I be interested in attending a meeting that her group was having. I went to that meeting, and it gave me such a relief because for the first time I was talking and I could feel that actually people heard me. So I got involved with Citizens Alert, and everywhere they would go, I would go, because it gave me that sense of having some support.
It was the culmination of amazing amounts of litigation in federal court to uncover the pattern and practice of torture Burge and others committed, and the culmination of organizing and activism in the streets, at the Chicago Police Board hearings, and then at City Council, led by Mary Johnson, Mary Powers of Citizens Alert.
At any rate, what happens from here is that I did an article in January of 1990 for the Reader, and the Office of Professional Standards reopened its investigation shortly thereafter, and they concluded that Wilson had indeed been tortured and that the torture was systematic and that command personnel had known about it. The Office of Professional Standards is the public body that investigated police brutality. And So eventually there were police board hearings in 1992, and Burge was thrown off the force in early 1993. And although the decision was very vaguely worded, you couldn't tell exactly why the police board had thrown him off the force. It said Burge did kick and or punch and or deny medical attention to. It never said anybody was tortured. The papers, both the dailies, ran headlines that indicated that Burge had been fired over torture charges.
That there's a sustained finding of torture against a man, and what happens? About 2,000 to 3,000 white police officers come out and celebrate it.
The law enforcement, and what they're doing is trying to neutralize good law enforcement in the city of Chicago.
Burge declined our attempts to interview him about his case.
And at that time, I think the local officials here in Chicago were really hoping that this police torture scandal was behind them. That if they cut off Burge and they terminated him from the department, we'd all go away. But the fact is, we didn't, and we couldn't. Because as a result of John Burge's torture of countless numbers of individuals, 11 were not only wrongfully convicted because their tortured confessions were used against them, but 11 of those individuals were sent to Illinois' death row. So simultaneously, while we were working on these death penalty cases, the lawyers came together and we were very frustrated by the fact that John Burge, nor any of the other white detectives who worked with him on the Midnight Crew, none of them had ever been criminally prosecuted for their crimes and their international human rights violations of torture. It was just unconscionable. And even though Burge could not have been prosecuted for his crimes of torture because the statute of limitations had expired, Burge, John Byrne, Peter Dignan, Burge's right-hand men, and others could have been prosecuted for the lies they told under oath denying the acts of torture. We then decided we had to go to the international fora to get the justice we needed. Standish Willis, he's the founder of Black People Against Police Torture, and he's a member of the National Conference of Black Lawyers. He called a group of us together, and he then said, we must bring these cases to the international fora because we will never get the respect or the justice locally. But we can hope that the international human rights experts will understand our plight and do what they can to help us get justice.
We both spoke in Geneva, Switzerland on the issue of torture in Chicago. And it wasn't long after that that the U.S. Attorney decided to open a file, seriously open a file, because they invited us to come and talk with them about the torture cases. But I think the United States was embarrassed because we were saying the United States had torture. It was torturing African Americans. And I'm sure they got a call from the Justice Department, because when you bring the United Nations in, you are really focusing on the United States, not just Chicago. And so when the United Nations, in their concluding observations, is what they call them, they mention Abu Ghraib, Guantanamo Bay, and Chicago, all in the same breath. They call, and I'm sure they tell them, look, do something about this stuff in Chicago. And we get a call within months. And not long after that, John Burge gets indicted.
A judge sentences former police commander John Burge to 4.5 years in prison for lying about the torture of suspects. And while that is twice as long as recommended according to federal guidelines, some victims describe it as a slap on the wrist.
I personally believe that if it wasn't for all of the organizing and activism we've done here locally, as well as going to the United Nations, we would not be here today. Burge being both convicted and sentenced to a crime of imprisonment for the heinous international human rights violations he committed in engaging in systemic torture.
There have been a hard core of dedicated activists, Mary Powers chief among them, who've grown gray in their efforts on this. But civil society, on the whole, has been disengaged. God knows there are lawyers here tonight, and others who aren't, who've beaten their heads against the wall for decades now. I don't know how they keep doing it. And they and those activists belong in some Chicago Hall of Fame.
Of course, this scandal has gone on now since 1972, which makes it almost a 40-year scandal. Remarkable police misconduct isn't quite serious enough a word. It's a human rights scandal of unprecedented nature here in the city or in this country.
The fact that John Burge is indicted and the fact that he's in prison is not sufficient. If our movement that Mary, of course, helped organize around police, if our movement sits back and celebrates at this point that we finally got him and stopped doing the work, nothing to happen. It's not enough. This should inspire the movement to work harder. It should inspire the movement to work harder, because we could say, okay, we got him, but let's get the rest of them. And if other people in other parts of the country do that, then the John Burge is just one hurdle that we've overcome. Because when you think about it in the broader scheme of things, they got one guy. There were dozens of these officers. They tortured perhaps close to 200 men. And not only did they torture them, many people knew about it.
Because you can't tell the John Burge story without telling about Richard Daley's involvement in it. As I alluded to earlier, Richard Daley was the state's attorney of Cook County in 1982 when it was first exposed that John Burge was at the center of a torture scandal. Because if Daley had indicted Burge in 1982, if Richard Brezek, the police superintendent, had fired Burge in 1982, then we wouldn't have to have had an Al Capone type of trial. But of course, Daley did nothing of the sort. That also led to the torture of 75 or 80 additional men.
And what's unusual about this lawsuit is a recent ruling allowing Daly to remain as a defendant and be sued for his alleged involvement in the case, both as state's attorney and the mayor.
He should have at that time investigated, he should have prosecuted, and if he had, Michael Tillman never would have been arrested, falsely charged, and falsely convicted or tortured.
And I think, in fact, the fact that Daly now is going to be included in a civil suit as a defendant is a great victory, and I'm glad we're all elated by it. But again, it's just another battle. We don't know how it's going to turn out. We don't know what a jury will do with it.
Former Mayor Richard Daley will not testify under oath this week about his involvement in a high-profile police brutality case. Daley was supposed to give a deposition for a lawsuit filed by former inmate Michael Tillman that involves former Chicago Police Lieutenant John Burge. Well, now this deposition is on hold.
We have to win the war. We have to win the war against institutional racism, particularly in the criminal justice system. There's no two ways about it.
Is torture ever right? Is torture ever something that should be countenanced in a society such as ours, under a constitution, under human rights principles? And of course the answer to that is no. Torture is never right. Torture should never be countenanced. It's always a human rights violation. So until the city of Chicago deals with this issue, and the changing of the guard deals with this issue, we'll never be able to cleanse the conscience of the city of Chicago about these horrific crimes and this horrific scandal.
Last in the courtroom, the judge, I explained it to the judge what had happened. I testified against Burge, and I told him what he did to me. The jury believed me. They found Burge guilty, which is a good thing. But the sad part was I had to live it all over again, as I'm doing now, as I do every night, every day. I mean, here again, you can describe it, but until you actually live it and been through it, I used to try and imagine how black people felt in Mississippi and Alabama back in the days when the Klan used to terrorize them. And I really couldn't get a good feel for what they must have felt, but November the 2nd, 1983 allowed me to get a very good feeling.
So I don't know what it's going to take, but I tell people all the time, just go home, do some push-ups, and come back out and start struggling all over again. Because I'm not going to stop.